Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're pleased to welcome you to Day 3 of RightsCity. This year's conference is focused on human rights in the digital age. And we're really pleased today to have two really important sessions, one on Can Democracies Unite on Tech to Fight Authoritarian Regimes, and another one on the use of social media to prosecute people for committing mass atrocity crimes. So we have two really fascinating sessions. Just like to thank all of our partners that made this possible. On behalf of my colleagues at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, we're one of the main organizers with the Royal Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. But this year we also have the support of the Canadian Department of National Defence through their Targeted Engagement Program. We have support of the Centre for Research and Education on Human Rights at the University of Ottawa. We have the support of the U.S. Embassy to Canada, as well as the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Canada. As well as the international organization Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes, and also the Canadian Commission to UNESCO. So we have a really kind of interesting group of organizations and diplomatic representations that are sponsoring this event. So with that to do, I'd like to pass the floor to Colin of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Colin, the floor is yours. You can introduce the speakers and facilitate the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Kyle. Well, as Kyle said, I'm Colin Robertson, and I'm Vice President and Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And I want to welcome you all to this panel on democracies and technology. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome our panelists, Kristin Lord, Chris Walker, and Thorsten Benner. Chris Walker is Vice President of Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy based in Washington. Kristin Lord is President and CEO of IREX, a global development and education organization also based in Washington. Thorsten Benner is co-founder and director of the Global Public Policy, an independent nonprofit think tank based in Berlin. Their mission is to improve global governance through research, policy advice, and debate. Chris and Kristin join us from DC, and Thorsten is in Berlin. I'm in Ottawa. Kyle Matthews, who will manage your questions at about the 45-minute mark, so do use that cue function, is in Montreal. A bit of context for our audience. At the Munich Security Conference in February, President Joe Biden said, "We must shape the rules that will govern the advance of technologies and the norms of behavior in cyberspace, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, so that they are used to lift people up, not used to pin them down." This comes amid talks from the Biden administration and others for a Western Tech Democracy Alliance, as more and more Western democracies are waking up to the challenge of authoritarian tech and human rights. Leaders in countries including Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela are increasingly using technology for liberal ends. As we've seen in the disinformation campaigns against the Hong Kong activists, current in the news today, following the anti-extradition protest in 2019 by China, espionage of Iranian activists, and hiring Twitter's employees to spy on Saudi activists by Saudi Arabia. So let's get started. Thorsten, I'll start with you as you come from farthest away, although not by cyberway. Since you're based in Germany, do you have any perspectives on what Germany or other European countries are doing or should be doing to address these big issues? Thorsten.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Kyle, for the invitation. And it's great to be with Kristin and Chris on this excellent panel on an important topic. Maybe for starters, I'll share my personal perspective, which I don't claim is any particular German or European perspective on this. I think the discussion on authoritarian tech is absolutely important, but it's also important that we actually keep perspective. First of all, that we see the proportions. Our democracies, they will not fail because of authoritarian tech. They will fail because actors in our democracy will use technology for liberal ends. What Prime Minister Orban has done in Hungary, building this illiberal state, the way he calls it himself, or what President Trump did in the US, they didn't use authoritarian tech in the sense that this is technology that comes from authoritarian countries, but they use technology for liberal ends, but that's our technology in democracy. So I think it's important to keep perspective in this whole game. And I just like to make two recommendations in terms of how we can move forward. On the one hand, I think it's important to have a defensive agenda. That means that our companies, we should make sure that they don't become complicit in repression in authoritarian regimes. You've listed in the introduction a number of examples where companies from democracies have enabled transnational repression or repression in authoritarian countries. For example, the companies, Western companies providing the swabs for genetic sampling in Xinjiang and the like. So we need to make sure that our companies are not complicit in repression, authoritarian repression. And that probably means, especially for kind of social media companies, that it will be very hard for them to be in aggressive authoritarian systems. And at the same time, I think we need to make sure that those who fled from repression in authoritarian systems and are now in our democracies, that we protect them from the long arm of authoritarianism and authoritarian tech, be that of President Putin or Erdogan, the Saudi regime, or China. And I think we have a lot of work to do on that front, because all too often activists are subject to transnational repression by these governments, and we don't do enough to protect them. And at the same time, I think it's important to use technology to uncover repression. I think we've done that quite successfully. Much of the evidence on Xinjiang has kind of come out of the intelligent use of technology, and I think we can also use it as a support for litigating mass atrocity crimes and so on. So I think we can use it positively. So there's a big case for kind of democracies coming together against authoritarian tech, but I would like to say that there's at least equally big a case for democracies to come together for democratic tech, because it shouldn't just be a defensive agenda where we kind of the main concern is with fending off authoritarian technology produced by and used by authoritarian countries. But I think we need to make sure that we use technology here in order to kind of support democracy and social justice. What you said in the beginning, that quote of President Biden at the Munich Security Conference, whether technology is used to lift people up, not to pin them down. I think the way that story turns out in our societies, that's mostly and totally in our hands. And I think we should think more along the lines of the likes of Ethan Zuckerman of MIT. A few years ago, he wrote a kind of an optimistic piece, or at least an aspirational piece, 6 or 7 ways that social media can enable democracy, and think along these lines, because I think we can only kind of be competitive in the competition of systems with authoritarian state capitalism if we ourselves make sure that technology doesn't weaken and undermine democracy at home, but that it strengthens democracy. So fortifying this at home and using technology for and learning to use technology for democratic ends, I think, is an important kind of part of our agenda.
Kristin, let me move to you and tell us a bit about IREX. You do a fair bit of work in capacity building leaders and institutions. Can you tell us a bit more about this work and what can be done to bolster the privacy and security of civil society groups that are being threatened?
Yes, thank you very much, Colin. It's a real delight to be here with all of you today. So to put our work in some kind of context, I think when we're thinking about authoritarian technology and how to respond, as Thorsten was talking about, not just defensively, but maybe more proactively, there are a number of places we can think about intervening. One is at the level of domestic or international policy. One is at the level of the tech platforms. But IREX really is working with individuals individual activists, individual human rights advocates, and so on, and also at the level of civil society organizations. And I think that's an area where there are actually huge asymmetries, I'd even say inequities, between civil society organizations and their ability to protect themselves, to defend themselves. And I just want to make a couple of points about some of the things we've learned through this kind of work. One of them is that, we really need to think about this work as not just being one-off trainings. Trainings are useful. You can teach people and their organizations how to protect themselves better. But the landscape is changing so quickly, the tools are changing so quickly, that we find it is much more effective to think about this as an ongoing form of support, an ongoing form of partnership. So that's one thing. I think it's especially useful if there are maybe hubs or resources set up that can serve a number of smaller organizations all at once, so that they're sort of constantly available as threats emerge. And again, to have that constant vigilance as things change. Another point I want to make is that we see a huge value in networking these organizations with each other. They really rely on each other, not just to share expertise, technical ideas, lessons learned, and so on, but also really to form some sense of solidarity. People who are engaged in this kind of work, these kinds of campaigns it's a very stressful activity. They feel a lot of emotional support when they band together. And so one thing that I, as an individual, have learned from our team in doing this work is that one of the most important things that we do to protect civil society organizations and individual activists is to provide psychosocial support. If they are able to protect their own psychosocial health, they are in a much better position to continue with their important work and continue protecting others. So it's that kind of unexpected human side that we need to not forget when we're focusing on technology and technological threats.
And Kristin, that's a very good point, I think, about groups like this, or yours and others, working together. To me, that's the great advantage that democracies have over the authoritarians. I recall I was at the Seoul Defense Dialogue a couple of years ago, prior to the pandemic, and I had dinner with a PLA colonel. And he, after a few drinks, he made the point that the one thing that the Chinese really did admire the United States for, but also feared, was its alliance system and the fact that our civil societies across nations work together. Not the same for authoritarians. So I think that's a very good point you make. Christopher, let me move to you. You testified recently on the threat of sharp power to the integrity of democracies. Could you tell us a bit about what sharp power is in your terms and how democratic systems could safeguard against it?
I think I'd answer the question in the following way with some context. I think if we think about where we are today in the struggle for democracy in global politics, we're 15 years into a democratic decline. But I would argue that the companion component to that is also a period of time of authoritarian resurgence. And interestingly, if you use the start date of the mid-2000s, which is Freedom House's assessment, it's also when the technological revolution took off. So Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube all came on the scene in earnest at that time. And I think we have to reckon with the impact of the technological revolution. On the one hand, this has offered authoritarian regimes to have the sort of reach that I think few really anticipated, certainly going back 20 or 25 years ago in the lead up to what has now become the period of democratic decline. At the same time, as Thorsten alluded to, I think democracies have really struggled to build norms around the technologies in ways that are consistent with democratic accountability, transparency, and human rights. And that's a very bad combination, where you have ambitious authoritarian regimes on the one hand, who, after all, have a point of view, they have a preference, they do not privilege free association or freedom of expression. On the contrary, one only needs to look at the way in which the regime in Beijing treats its own citizens or those in, for example, Hong Kong, to get a flavor of their approach to these things. And likewise in Russia, freedom of expression is repressed fiercely there by the authorities in the country. And so it's not really a surprise that when they reach beyond their borders, they take that sensibility with them. And when it comes to that sort of interaction beyond their borders, what my colleagues and I have found, and this is true in a report that we've released today, which has updated some of our research on these issues, is that in many cases, what we find is the effects of the engagement from China, its government, and its surrogates has the effect of encouraging censorship or otherwise sidelining debate on certain issues, or enhancing or baking in surveillance when it comes to the tech side of things. I think the key issue here is for the democracies, it's really up to them in the end, for us, to develop approaches that can defend essential values. We can't expect that, for example, the authorities in China, who face no real pressure domestically to change, who have very clear visions for how these things should be organized, not only in terms of governance domestically, but increasingly in key rule-setting bodies, whether it's within the UN or elsewhere when it comes to technology standards. They will pursue those interests in the absence of any sort of check on their power, which means it's actually up to the democracies, as we say in the report we released today, to stimulate a race to the top and to make certain that democratic values animate and surround technology, both for our own society's health, but I think also for the larger struggle that's emerged, including in countries that are deciding what path they're going to take and really do have a choice as to whether it will be more in the direction of more surveillance and censorship baked into the technology, or whether it will be a path that privileges and respects privacy, openness, transparency, and freedom of expression.
We have two questions that are similar. We only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to read both, and hopefully each of the three fellows can give like 20-second comment on them. But so the first question says, it's from Twitter: authoritarian states manipulate Western tech platforms. What can be done to prevent this? The second one says, this one's from YouTube: should reciprocity be applied by Western democracies in that authoritarian leaders and government officials don't allow social media platforms in their societies, but are allowed to use them in the West to spread disinformation? Should we ban them from these platforms?
Okay. Now, in 20 seconds or less, let me start with you, Chris.
So it's a pretty complicated question to have 20 seconds on, but I think it speaks to the conundrum that has arisen in the modern era, which is everyone can move across borders and these areas of expression pretty seamlessly. I would be reluctant to lowering the boom entirely on these things. I think it's up to democracies to build out the rules that safeguard their information space without becoming the authoritarians themselves.
I align with Chris.
I too aligned with Chris. I think it's very well put. And in fighting authoritarian impulses, we don't want to become the very thing we're trying to prevent.
Final question to you all, and I'm going to start with you, Kristin. What are you reading or streaming these days?
I just finished reading Michael Lewis's The Premonition about people who predicted the pandemic, all the obstacles they found along the way, and how in free societies, small groups of people can band together to push change. It's both frightening and there's a little bit of heartening aspect to it as well.
I'm reading, not streaming The Crown, but I'm reading a novel by a Georgian-German author called Nino Haratiashvili called The Eighth Life for Grilka, and it tracks the tragic, in a very moving way, it tracks the tragic lives of one Georgian family across the long 20th century and its trials and tribulations. And it's beautifully written, as I said, very tragic and moving, and I can very much recommend this book.
So it's apropos of our discussion, really just enjoyed rereading Ron Diebert's book, Reset, where he both dissects the challenges that have emerged in the digital domain in a very thoughtful but candid way, and then to his great credit offers some recommendations on how we can address these things.
Well, thank you, Christopher, Thorsten, and Kristin. We were joined today by Kristin Lord, Chris Walker, and Thorsten Benner. Thorsten. Stay with us for the next panel, and now I'm going to segue back to Kyle and team.
Thank you, Colin, for doing an amazing job at moderating that session. It was one that we could have spent hours on discussing, but didn't have time. But I think it really gave us a lot to reflect on about the idea about Western tech companies and how they must unite. How Western democracies could unite in the tech alliance. I would like to first thank all the different partners who contributed this year to this event. First, we thank the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the Department of National Defense's Targeted Engagement Program, the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, led by John Packer, the Embassy of the Netherlands to Canada, Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes Network, the US Embassy to Canada, and this is also being held under the patronage of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO.